Good morning, everyone who is joining in from Europe. So I'm Jessie from the Singapore Global Network, Regional Director for Network and Partnership Development. I'm based in Singapore, but I look at countries in Europe such as Germany and Switzerland. So to those who are new to the Singapore Global Network, we are a global community of Singaporeans as well as friends of Singapore, really with the purpose of connecting with one another for thought leadership exchange, for community, for support, and also to I guess make friends with one another as well. So today we are very pleased to host our first virtual community event in a long while for our audience in Europe who are spread across different countries, different cities, all very fragmented. We thought that a virtual event might work best in bringing perspective from different places together, and also to allow more people to join in. So this very topic, mind over matter, coping with stress, anxiety, and conflict, is something that I guess resonates with a lot of people in our network and to a lot of people that, not just me, but I'm sure you as well, speak to on a daily basis. So before we begin with the fireside chat proper, I would just like to remind you of a few house rules. Please do respect our speakers when they are speaking. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen as well. So feel free to submit your questions whenever you have them in the Q&A function. We will address the questions after the panel. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Kendra, Lira, and Anna to take the stage, the virtual stage. Ladies, please.
Thank you so much, Jessie, and a very, very warm welcome to everyone joining us today. For me, living abroad introduces us to new cultures, workplace norms, and personal relationships, and each requires us to adapt, and that can often provoke stress and anxiety. So today we are here to address these challenges, not just in a professional realm, but also on an interpersonal level. We will explore the complex relationship between stress, anxiety, conflict, and our mental well-being, and hopefully shed some light on practical strategies on how to navigate these hurdles and enhance our experience living abroad. So hopefully we all leave this discussion with a deeper understanding of these cross-cultural challenges, and I hope that everyone gains an enriched toolkit to help manage them. So thank you all once again for joining us, and let's begin our discussion by introducing our esteemed guests, Anna and Lira. Anna is a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist who is based in Munich, and she specializes in behavioral therapy. And Lira is a conflict resolution and mediation advisor based in Zurich. So thank you so much, Anna and Lira, for joining our panel. I would like to start off with Anna. Could you tell us a bit more about yourself, how you ended up in Munich maybe, and what your practice entails?
So thank you for having me. So I am a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist, and I have my own clinic in Munich, Germany. And there I see both adults and children with a diverse intercultural background, and I also treat like a wide range of mental illnesses. So what brought me to Munich is studying. So I came here as a student, and I did my master's here and then my PhD. So I kind of stayed and then just ended up living here a really long time, and then now I have my own clinic, so I'm working here. That's what brought me basically right now.
Perfect. So you are a Europe veteran. not just having the work experience here, but also studying and just living life.
Correct. So I do understand, and also because I've lived in Germany a long time, and so I do understand, when people come, even as a student or even as a working professional, the difficulties that they can face when adapting as well to a whole different culture. And I think we will go into that as well later, definitely in the talk, but about the difference as well between the Singaporean and German culture. Mm-hmm. And that this, of course, will be one of them that it is quite different in certain ways.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it's really a great resource for us to have, somebody who understands the nuances of a professional who understands the nuances of Singaporean and also European culture right here in the heart of Germany. Then I would also like to really understand from Lira, like what is being a conflict resolution and mediation advisor? What does that entail? And also, how do you end up in Zurich?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kendra. Lovely to be here and to be with everyone today. So being a conflict resolution and mediation advisor is pretty exciting work and pretty creative work. My background was in international armed conflict, mediating an armed conflict. So you can imagine the stakes were pretty high. And on the other hand, I also specialized in therapy and mental health, specifically trauma-focused therapy. So I blended those two worlds to specialize in trauma-informed mediation. More than happy to go into that at some point. But it basically means being able to help people mediate and resolve a conflict they might have. That could be a stressful situation, a conflict with other people, multiple parties. It could be at the workplace. It could be at home. Obviously, I worked in a more humanitarian setting at a political level. But really, I think what's interesting about my work is at the end of the day, it's about the person and it's about how we're doing inside and our own mindset. And I think that really kind of outlines a lot of the trauma-informed mediation work I do. So peace at the individual level. Yeah.
So you're a mediator for in all aspects of life, at work, in personal life, and even if we get into political mishaps.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it sounds like it's really, really broad, but I think at the end of the day, what really happened was it all starts at the individual level. And that's what I encountered in my work as well. It doesn't matter if you're playing the really high stakes, and that could be in a corporate setting, that could be in a humanitarian setting. At the end of the day, we're dealing with individuals and interpersonal relationships and different cultures, right? And those are across the board, no matter what level we are dealing with. And interpersonal could be you and a neighbor, it could be you and a family member. And different cultures come into play there as well. So yeah, so I really work through all the different aspects, no matter what level, just starting at the individual.
Absolutely. And I think at this point, just to kickstart our conversation, I would like to ask Lira and Anna, as individuals, like what are your personal experiences and challenges that you have experienced living overseas, being a Singaporean expatriate? I guess Anna could start us off.
Yeah, so I think one of the major hurdles, I think, when I first arrived was definitely the language hurdle. And I think this is maybe what I feel maybe many people will also face this if you're actually, living abroad in a country that actually doesn't speak the language that you speak from your home country. So I think this was initially the first thing. So, it may sound like maybe not, but this one thing has actually like many other repercussions for other things, things that you need to navigate around the bureaucracy, you need to be able to see the doctor, you need to be able to do a lot of things. And with only limited language skills, it can be very difficult, and it's kind of like the stress, of course, of not knowing already, the whole thing's new, navigating the system alone, but then navigating the system in a foreign language it increases, of course, the challenges that one faces, of course. So I think that for
spills
me,
over into all aspects of your life, not just the ability to have a conversation or order a hamburger, right?
Right. And I still can remember, like, when I was still a student, so I was quite thankful, when I came as a student, and we would like sit around with other students, everyone's like speaking German, and like in my mind I'm just constantly translating it, like into English, obviously. And yeah, I'll be like very, very slow, like maybe like after the conversation's long past, and I'll be like, oh wait, like 10-15 minutes, I have a point now to that topic that was like 10 minutes ago, I have something to say now. So yeah, things like that, like, just have to get used to it. Yeah.
So how would you suggest, for example, dealing with language barrier? Do you think like one of the most important things we should do when we move to a new country is absorbing the language and doing all we can to get proficient as quickly as possible?
Yes, I do think if one is moving to another country which speaks a different language from their home country, I do think that it's important, especially if you want to live there long term, right? If you're only living there short term, of course, this is obviously tricky how much time you want to invest in it. But I do think that it is definitely useful even to do like, to know a few phrases or to know a few basic terms, because this really can be useful even, to get around. So yeah, I mean, I would say yes, I would recommend that, people at least have a basic knowledge of that language, because it can be very useful for them living there.
Lira, what are your thoughts? What are your personal challenges?
Wow, yeah. There are so many, right? Like, where do we start? And just speaking to one of your earlier questions, maybe, what's the experience of living abroad? And maybe that kind of segues into this as well. So my experience, and hopefully we'll speak to some of us here today for the participants as well, is of being a third culture kid. Maybe that sounds a bit like one of you here. Maybe that sounds like children that you've had overseas. I'm kind of the product of that. So it just meant that I was moving a lot since I was a kid. I was born in Singapore. We moved to England. I was in Australia. I was in Israel. I was in France. Now I'm in Switzerland. And it's just been, it's been a lot. It's been a lot of identities to take on. And I think in that, my experience of being a Singaporean abroad has been really great. Right. And I think the Singaporean identity and of so many people these days is one of fluidity. Right. So many of us have grandparents and ancestors that came as fairly recent immigrants. And we're all children of that. We're all products of that. And I think we carry on this kind of fluid, explorative identity. I think it's also being a Singaporean overseas is also being perceived in a certain way. And for me, that's been also really interesting because I don't necessarily sound Singaporean, nor is that just like the single facet of my personality or culture that I identify with, right? And again, maybe that speaks to people here as well. It starts with being a confusion of having different sides to yourself, different ways that you speak, different languages you speak, and then eventually coming to reconcile them together. So I feel like when people ask me who I am, I say I'm Singaporean, and the next question is either where were you, or you don't sound like it, or etc. And it's just been learning to blend and express what that means to people. So yeah.
So do you think that these issues of identity, like, when the people, the clients that you meet when you work, is this predominantly their issue too, like questions of identity, or like what are the challenges most often encountered by your expat clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question, in that I think culture and that mutual understanding that we carry different cultures is something that really gels us between me and my clients. And I think people come in with a variety of issues, being mostly expat clients, people with multicultural backgrounds, workforces and teams with really diverse makeups. And I think some of the issues are misunderstandings that come up. Sometimes they have to do with language barriers. So just kind of hooking back to one of your early questions, like some of the challenges, but language barriers, as Anna was talking about, is absolutely one of them, right? How do I pick up and learn and adapt to my new environment? And if I could just add just another layer into that, I think it's the understanding of the local etiquette and references that really make us feel at home, right? So in whichever cultural country I've lived in, I've had to pivot to new cultural understandings, new maybe brands of humor, right? And even how to make a phone call. And maybe this is something that both you ladies in Germany can identify with as well. I think we've got some listeners in from France, from the UK and other Asian countries. And it's different, right? It's not stuff that they teach you necessarily in language school. They teach you how to, maybe order your food or have a conversation and introduce yourself. But it's the little things. In German-speaking countries, it's quite formal, right? When you pick up the phone, and that doesn't come across in the language books. How distant people are, how we queue up, it's very different. It's very culturally specific. So I think kind of learning those things really helps. But just then hooking right back to your question, what do people come with as issues? These are some of those adaptive issues that they come with, a new sense of being lost in a new landscape, right, of different etiquette, of different language, of different values and norms of being. And the clients I see suddenly find themselves going, the way I used to solve a conflict or get through life is not necessarily the same, right? Values have changed in this area. So those are some of the traditional things.
I do think your point of feeling lost, like the language barrier is like just one really large manifestation or a cause of this. I just want to circle back to Anna's point, because like we were talking about the language barrier and how it can seep into all aspects of life. So how do you, Anna, think that this does it lead us to a sense of perhaps losing our independence, and what can this do for our mental health really? Because I had personal experiences of feeling very, very lost here, and also kind of losing my independence because I have to rely on my German husband to, do everything for me. And that's not how I've lived my entire life back in Singapore. So maybe could you share with us a bit more how this, impacts our mental health and how, our overall well-being would be affected?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, right, you're definitely spot on, Kendra. So definitely like the language issue takes away our independence, because things like, like I mentioned, like bureaucracy or like the doctor suddenly at the beginning, when we're not very fluent, we can't do this ourselves. So that means either we need a friend, if we even have friends at that stage of our transition in the new country, or our spouse, right? And this can also be, of course, stress in the relationship, because then, like, for example, so the interpersonal part of it, to say, right now I'm kind of dependent now, let's say, on my husband to make the phone call for me, right? So that means I can't do things when I want it to be done. I can't just call and say, oh, what date looks good for you, what looks good for me. But it's more like I need to tell my husband, these are these dates. I need to double check with him. I need to wait. When do you have time? I need to ask. It's like then one feels like, the things that I have done before, or back home, like I can't do all this again, right? And then of course that goes down again, the sense of like independence and self-worth, that people feel like not very they just feel like this sense of low self-esteem, because they can't do all these things. And also being dependent on other people can be also really frustrating, and also can be, of course, like a source of stress, let's say, on the relationship to a certain extent. And also due to the language barrier, it could also be like another sense of isolation, having been able to make friends, so it's more like, let's say, the language causes the reduced independence, maybe coupled with the isolation. So the consequences of this causes, like, that when one is more isolated, right, then maybe I already feel really stressed and anxious, with the whole maybe losing my independence, the whole adapting to the new country, and then I isolate myself, right? And then when I isolate myself, I have nobody, and then all the more one goes into like a spiral. It's easier, let's say, to put it down. It doesn't always necessarily have to mean a depression, but it can go in that direction.
Okay, and you mentioned, conflict, about how like this anxiety or this when you start questioning your identity, it can lead you to becoming more anxious, and therefore, creating conflict in your relationships. Maybe Lira could be a really good resource at this point. Like, how are questions of identity linked with conflict, and how do we cope with that? How do we mitigate that?
Yeah, thanks. It's such an interesting question, because identity has so much to do with values, right? When you think about identity and how you describe that, it's not necessarily how you look or how you speak or where you're from. It can often be about your values. And in new environments, those values can be called into question, because those same values are expressed in different ways. I'll take a concrete example, so we're not just talking conceptually, but it might be respect. That's a big one. So you might think part of my identity is respect, and maybe as an Asian person, it's filial piety, right? That's part of what makes me Asian. And then you come to a part of the world that views respect towards elders and parents and ancestors really differently. It's not wrong, it's just really different. And perhaps it's less of a collectivist, relationalist culture and more of an individualistic one that, places just less emphasis on filial piety. But if you've got, for example, here we're talking about really personal values. So let's just take an example of a couple. And let's say the Asian partner is demonstrating and spending a lot more time on these values as part of their identity. And in concrete terms, that could be spending a lot of time on phone calls, across the time zone differences with their family back in their home country. And this starts to somehow eat into the family time that this person has with their non-Asian partner who shares different values and puts different emphasis on those values, right? And then that creates this incendiary situation for conflict to occur because both people have needs based on their identity that are not met or expressed in the same way. And the truth is neither is wrong or right. If the other found themselves in an Asian setting, then their values would be different, right? So it's about finding that way through for that individual challenge.
And how do we meet in the middle then?
Yeah, so that is the magic that comes through, right? About meeting in the middle. And then now we're talking about things like more active conflict resolution techniques like negotiation and compromise, right? There's so much overlap with mental health there. But the very first thing is, I think, starts with self-awareness. So we go back to the individual, but really I think the magic happens when we realize how much is in my control and how much isn't. And I think this relates to anxiety as well, right? Anxiety really peaks when we feel like we have no control over a situation or different factors. And we feel this dis-ease, this discomfort, hence the anxiety. And I think when people come to a point of awareness and acceptance that even if the other party to this conflict or my partner will never, ever change, what can I do to change, right, in that situation? And that gives them so much choice and kind of comfort to know that there is freedom to find different ways through, that they are creative. And in this particular instance, we're talking about, if we use the same example of the couple, it's going to be talking about self-awareness of individual needs. So is my need to be seen by the other? And so maybe the Asian partner is saying, I really want to be seen for who I am, which is someone who respects my elders and puts time into family relationships. And the other partner saying, well, my need is to spend time with you and feel like I'm at the center of the universe, not your elders, right? And so with that awareness, we go into that actual need, which is maybe a sense of security and belonging, right? That's, if you like, the common denominator in their needs. And then we find ways how that can be met, because I think that's a really creative, when we break open those gates, that's a really creative field.
Interesting. So Anna, if you have a couple coming into your practice with the exact same problem that Lira just described, like what sort of advice would you give them to cope with this situation?
Yeah, so I do think Lira already covered quite detailed already how normally it would be resolved. I think it's like pretty much what she said. So it's like normally if couples come and let's say it's like an intercultural issue, so normally we would definitely also look at the values behind it. Like, so it's always looking at the motivation behind the behavior. Right, so that's the one thing we look at. So I think that's what she's saying, to say, filial piety and like respect and things like that. But what is my interpretation of respect? What is your interpretation of respect? And look at the motivation behind the behavior, and then being able to express that in a way that the other person can understand. I think this is the sort of one of the important things also, like that normally in the therapy that we discussed here as well, like how can we phrase it in a way that, why is filial piety important to me, and what does it look like, things like I do this because of filial piety, and filial piety means to me this and that because it's important for, you know, X, Y, Z. So everyone would also, you know, even every Asian person would take filial piety differently. But I do think that the couples then will then work on, you know, exploring the different values that they have, and then being able to express it adequately to their partner, so that the partner will then here will be the most important, when the partner can understand it, right? And then they could come, like what Lira said in the next phrase, when both of them can understand where each other's coming from, and then to say, okay, what would be the next problem solving method? And then here would be, depending on the couple, would be so many different types of problem solving. You know, sometimes it's a compromise, sometimes it's not a compromise. Sometimes one says, oh, you know, I realize how important this is for you. You know, this thing's actually not that important for me. Depending on what, of course, what values. I mean, not based on this example, but, you know, depending on the values that they have. This could also be one problem solving method. Yeah.
I'm wondering, so this pertains to, you know, interpersonal relationships in your private sphere, but what about, you know, when you have intercultural conflict at work, for example, you know, and I think, you know, the Asian and the German or European working style is hugely different, and, you know, I'm not going to be able to force my boss or my colleague to go with me to therapy. So like, how do I, you know, kind of like unilaterally apply techniques to resolve this conflict between me and my colleague, for example?
So I think at work, it's a bit more difficult. I mean, it's not the same. You wouldn't use the same techniques per se. But I do think that one can still express themselves, as in, like, let's say, I think German people are more direct, and let's say Asian people are less direct, right? So I think one thing maybe is to know of the etiquette and how people express themselves, right? And then maybe then I could say, I mean, let's say I'm the Asian person there in the work setting. I mean, I could think about whether I could either think about whether maybe I know that this person is saying directly, but maybe they don't mean it as harsh as I am taking it. This could be one way, right? Or I could also think about how other ways I could phrase myself, right? How can I change my communication to fit in better to, let's say, the work communication patterns.
I think then this makes me wonder, and I think maybe Lira could answer this for us, like, you know, what's the balance between, because you're just talking about identity and, you know, how sometimes we feel lost, what's the balance between our self-identity and adapting or adjusting to a different culture? For example, like if I go to work and I decide to adopt a more direct communication style, but that doesn't make me feel like myself because that's not what I'm used to. So where is the balance, and how do we achieve this balance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the golden answer that every like corporate culture wants to get to, right? How do you squeeze the most out of the diversity and talent of the workforce while allowing them to be themselves and shine? So that's tricky, and I think it requires more a collective approach within that company culture, right? So it's very different, I think, if we're thinking of the individual that is the lone person that's different from the wider culture, because I think then the work, kind of the onus lies more on the person who is the outlier, if you may, right? So case in point could be the sole Asian person in a European company, right? And they're going to have to kind of adapt and work on themselves as to more direct styles of communication, a different sense of hierarchy, a different sense of working hours, right? It doesn't matter if your boss is still there. If you've done your work, you can go home. That's really different in an Asian setting, right? Where you want to stay around till your boss goes home, you know? So I think those are the individual elements that need to change. But if you're talking about a workplace, and hopefully this is interesting for those tuning in, more thinking about workplace situations and conflicts, is how do you, I think your question was, how do you kind of remain true to your identity while also kind of performing within that company culture? And I think this is where cultural competence comes in. Intercultural training, for example, in these workplaces go the distance, they go the mile in terms of employee satisfaction, making people feel valued and heard in their diversity, in their ways of communicating. And when we have a training workshop, for example, or a focused conversation with staff, that's where I think the walls start to break down and people start to see, oh, that's what you're bringing from your culture. That's really great. And this is what I bring, and this is where we can meet. So it's a really long answer, but in short, I think it's awareness that something's happening. It's acceptance that something needs to change. And then it's action, right? We're actually going to address the issue by opening the communication.
Anna, do you have anything to add to this? Because I think when we were discussing this before, you were mentioning something about some cognitive behavioral model. Would that be applicable in, this example and this situation?
So the cognitive behavioral model doesn't fit right in with the communication model, but the cognitive behavioral model will fit in explaining things like how I can regulate myself in the workplace, right? So what Lira said is like definitely it's important, right? So it's like those are the problem solving, right? I should definitely, things like improve my language, improve my intercultural competence in order to get the tools that I need. But the cognitive behavioral model says basically that, there are like thoughts, behavior and feelings, and my thoughts influences both my feelings and my behavior, and my behavior influences my thoughts and feelings, and all of them influence each other. So basically the example, let's say keep it to the workplace. So let's say something happens, my boss says something like, that I find is like maybe really harsh to me. And maybe my first thought is, he doesn't like me, or, he is being really mean to me right now. And maybe my mood is like, I feel a little bit sad, a little bit hurt, a little bit angry. And my behavior is, I try to avoid him, maybe, or I try to, I start tiptoeing around him the next time. And then this again could spiral then the thought, right? Then because the more I tiptoe around him, the more I avoid him, then it could increase the thought that, he really doesn't like me. I don't see him all the time. And then after it increases again, gosh, the feeling that, wow, I feel really, really hurt by his behavior. And then this is the cognitive behavioral model that this can this is like a circle, right? But then here I could change. I could either say, how else can I differently interpret the situation? I could change, for example, in this situation, the easiest would be to ask myself, like, how can I interpret the situation other than, he is really on purpose being mean to me right now. And then this in turn could say, maybe I still can feel hurt, right? Because maybe for me, it is a very, very harsh comment or a harsh way of saying things, right? But then I could still say, but it's not, he didn't mean it with ill intentions, although I feel hurt by it, right? And then maybe my behavior is I won't avoid him, right? So it means in that sense, by not avoiding him, I'm more open to use the tools like intercultural competence and, and the language skills and things like that to continue talking to him instead of reversing the situation. I still go forward with the situation, right? So the cognitive behavioral model is more like a model to explain one's behavior and then how one can also regulate it themselves, like inside.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. So basically, I mean, clearly there's a strong link between anxiety and stress and intercultural conflict. I'm just curious, how are they linked in a sense? Like, does one produce the other, or is it chicken or egg, or is it a cycle? What is it like? How are they linked? Anxiety and intercultural conflict. Does Lira want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Definitely come across many, many anxious people in intercultural settings. And I think here we're going to talk about the needs and the resources again, right? So in general, when we find ourselves in a new culture, for all the reasons we've just canvassed, there ends up being this heightened sense of anxiety. And it could be from the little things, right? How do I look? I look really different. People are watching me because I look different, or I sound different, I can't speak the language, to the bigger things like anxiety over how I'm performing at the workplace with my boss, in a new relationship I'm navigating, or childcare that is really different here from what I've known. So these are the sort of the daily, the ins and outs, the practicalities of why we end up being really stressed or anxious. And here I want to talk about the resources, and then I'll link them together, because I think when we are in our home settings, or the settings that we're familiar with, we've got our social support systems and the sense of confidence and agency that we have. Oh, I know where to go. I know how this works. I know how to interact with this person or this setting. And suddenly, when we are in a new cultural setting, maybe even within a country, right, we're just in a different company or a different circle of friends, we lose this sense, these resources that are so key to enabling us to feel seen and heard and agents of our own lives. So when you reduce that, it adds to the anxiety and conflict, but it also takes away from our ability to solve problems in the only ways we've known, right? So then we end up encountering conflict, but in a way that makes us flounder more than ever. Does that make sense? Because we have less resources. So it's sort of, as I was saying earlier, this incendiary situation, but that's why people find relocations really difficult. That's why people find moving across continents and countries, or marrying or being in a partnership with somebody else of a different culture really challenging. But to wrap that up, you can see how hopefully that connects, and maybe where they need to be addressed, which is finding those resources.
At this point, I would really like to, know from Anna and Lira, what can you share with us, one or two coping strategies to manage this anxiety and the lack of resources to deal with it? Anna?
Okay, I'll start. Yeah. So well, I think that the most important, the first one is definitely to set realistic expectations, to set realistic smaller goals, and also to prioritize those goals, right? Because when you move into a new country, you suddenly have a lot of things, you need to do your work, or you need to study, you need to build up with friends, you need to find out where to do your hobbies, and you need to navigate the system and things like that. So I think it would be important, for the person first to set kind of realistic expectations, to also know that you can't prioritize every single aspect as on the same level of priority, and then to say I'll focus on a few, and then there are different ways to go about it. But I think this is the first one. It's important to know that it's not going to be it's not going to be done just like that. Yeah. Well, the next one I think would be to definitely build up a social network, because being in a new country, especially if you don't know anybody there, right? So of course one way, of course, if you're like a student, or you know that people from let's say previously other Singaporeans, let's say, who have been studying in that country, you could connect with them and stuff like that. But if you don't have that, right, then I think obviously another way, one important point is to build up a social network, because it can be very isolating otherwise, or it can be also take some time. And this doesn't mean that you need to make friends with other students. I think building up social network can mean building up with even people of the home country. It doesn't necessarily have to be as expats. But I would say social networking would be also another important factor. I think a positive mindset, of course, also helps. So I think the cultural adjustment curve is like an inverted U, right? It starts off like honeymoon phase, and then it goes down culture shock, and then it goes to adjustment, and then mastery of the situation. So just to keep it a positive mindset that although we don't know how long this curve will look like, when I will master the situation, but to know that over time, so patience would also, that things will get better. I will have friends, and the more you know about the culture, the etiquette, the better it will be. Yeah, and another one I feel like I can't stress enough is not to be afraid to make mistakes, because I think this is really important and also almost unavoidable when being new abroad, just to be able to try out new things. When you don't know all the etiquette yet, it's inevitable sometimes. You don't doing it on purpose, but to say, it's okay, I'm still willing to take the risk to try, also when sometimes I say something wrong or I do something and not so that I think, oh my gosh, that's not so appropriate, to say, okay, I'll learn from it, and then just take that in as part of learning and adjusting to the new culture. Yeah.
I think social networking can really help also with speeding up the curve and maybe helping you make less mistakes, because the people who have done it before can tell you what to do, where to find the good Asian food and all that. Lira, do you have any, can you share with us some of your strategies too?
Yeah, sure. I think Anna outlined the really valuable, concrete, practical points. And maybe what I can add to that, if helpful, is going back to the individual level, right? So these are practical strategies that we can employ and I think are really important. And maybe we'll start with the base part of it, which is ourselves. And here I'm just going to throw into the ring self-awareness. I think that's a really strong coping strategy to start with. And in here, I would link that as well with the sense of knowing what's within our control and what's not, because that's going to really help us cope with anxiety, right? And just realize that you can find all kinds of stencils online, or these drafts that you can use online that are just about these control rings, if you like. I find them really helpful, and when people use them, they go, so what it basically is you start in the middle with how much is actually within your control, then these concentric circles of I have some control, I have no control over. And when I talk about self-awareness, I talk about being more and more aware of what's triggering your anxiety in that new culture, in that new place, in that new relationship, etc. And write them down if helpful. A mental health professional can help you through that as well, because going through something is lonely enough as it is and difficult enough. Sometimes community just really helps us, and we build that awareness of what's triggering us, because sometimes we don't know what it is. We just go, I'm feeling really anxious. But what is it really? Are there different times it happens? Are there different situations or people with whom it happens? So we gather all this data and we actually can put this into these really helpful graphs visually to show us, oh, this is where I'm triggered. And isn't it funny? I'm getting triggered by something that perhaps is really far off, is completely not in my control. So that's where we can begin to even deepen those coping mechanisms a bit more and develop that strategy to manage anxiety in new cultures. And I think the second thing that I wanted to throw in was when we do find ourselves floundering and not knowing what to do in the process of making friends, expanding a circle, everything that Anna spoke about, was, I think, being able to just pause, breathe, listen, and ask questions. I think there's nothing more powerful in the moment of not knowing, of discomfort, than just going, wow, instead of accepting this, I can just actively listen without judgment and ask questions. That is almost the most important thing to do in a conflict, because when we ask questions, we get so much more information that we can work through, and helps us understand where the other lies and how we can pivot around to find a solution. So yeah, those would be my tips or contributions.
Thank you so much, Lira, and thank you so much, Anna, for these really helpful tips. And I think with that, I'm going to move now into the Q&A, because we received quite a number of questions, and they are all really, I personally think, really good questions. So I want to start with this first question, which I wish I had the answer to before moving here, and that is, how how can one prepare for university or a new job in a new country with a different culture? What would be the best way to fit in a new country without feeling helpless and not having any friends? Because I think, a big part of the tips that you guys gave us is, form social network, make friends, but practically, how easy it is really to find friends and, put yourself out there to meet new people in the whole new environment. And now you look like you have something to say.
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy to answer the question. Yeah, so I think, I think the obvious would be, firstly, definitely read up about the country that you're going to, read up about the culture, read up about the etiquette. And I think about, preparing. Well, so I think I would say if you prepare for universities, it may be a little bit different than preparing for a new job. So I do think university is slightly easier in a way because it will be other international students, whereas a new job this may not necessarily be. I mean, right now, a lot of things are quite international in many workplaces, but this may not necessarily be the case. Whereas, in the university, there are a lot of at least here in Europe, like Erasmus programs, with people of different parts of Europe, different countries, where you can either hang out with other international students or, there are a lot of options for students, even if interest groups, where you can join and, and then, and students generally, they speak English. So this also not obviously a bit easier, I think, in this aspect. So of course, depending on the job that you're working, most likely as well, like the people there will also speak English. But I do think that because as a student, it's like it's not just studying, but it's like you have your lectures and then you have this free time, but you can use actually to socialize, right? And of course, I think for a new job, this will be, of course, harder because you only get to socialize outside of the workplace, right? So I do think that here would be a question of prioritizing the time as well, and also thinking, what interest groups are there, and really making the effort. Because I do think this requires effort. Because I know if you work a long hours and then after that you're having to do another social event, like meeting new people, it can be quite draining. Yeah, but I think this is still like important for the individual to think about, to say, maybe I could do it maybe just once a week or only on the weekends, or that it doesn't just slide, in the like I'm just too tired from every day, and then these things just kind of get forgotten.
And I think when you're starting a new job, you have to kind of simultaneously adjust to the new workplace and also build social connections with your colleagues, which is pretty daunting.
If I could just jump in here as well, I think the second part of the question here, just to add to what Anna was saying as well, but I think part of the question was, what would be the best way to fit into a new country without feeling helpless and not having any friends? And I think here it calls into mind mindset, right? So I think when we do find ourselves in a new situation, the more we tell ourselves, I don't have any friends, you don't make time for it, you're like, well, it's just stressful because I don't have any friends. We get into this kind of self-shaming mindset, right? And again, we take away our agency of thinking, oh, I can't do it. But I think here's where I would suggest just turning that mindset, being open to turn it. Actually, you've got probably loads of friends where you came from. How did you make those friends? Those friends are still with you. So thankfully, we live in a really connected world. You take those friendships with you. They're still very much with you. And have that be as practical as you need. Maybe it's mementos, it's photos, maybe it's phone calls with them, but that's going to give you still that confidence that I am a person who can make and maintain friendships. That's still me, just in a new setting, and I can just keep working on that, right? And think about the ways you've made friends, because I think that's really different between introverts and extroverts. We have really specific likings and different environments you want to be in. And if you find yourself being a more introverted person and feeling kind of, oh no, you're looking at social media and feeling so much FOMO, people are doing so many activities and I'm just here, in my own apartment, don't worry about that, because maybe your, ideal kind of social contact is one or two really, deep friendships that you see once or twice a month. and have that be maybe your goal over, 6 months to develop, right? Give yourself that long stretch to develop. And yeah, so I think starts with mindset and thinking about how I did used to do it.
One phrase that you said really stood out to me, which is like, I'm still me in a new environment. And I think this leads into the next question that we have, which is, how do you maintain your identity and culture when you have been away from home for long? And after a point in time, let's say 10 or 15 years, wouldn't you feel like an imposter of your own native culture? And I think that is also, a question that a lot of people have, like, I don't want to lose myself. I don't want to become like a fake German or, Anna, would you like to take this one?
I was just thinking about that because I feel like that's me, basically this question, because I've been away for very, very long. So I would say I try to, so this is just like me personally. I try to kind of, still kind of connect to, everything Singaporean, be it the food or the people, or let's say the festivals and things like that. Like, even things like, Singaporean things, even from Singaporean stories to, everything, I would like watch National Day Parade on YouTube, things like that. Yeah, so just for me also, right, to feel like, I'm still somehow tied, or I mean, not to say like to foster my own Singaporean identity, but it's more like, for me to feel like, hey, look, there are things about home that I miss, and that, by experiencing these things, it helps when I'm not physically there. Yeah, and then of course, I think maintenance is also saying like kind of trying to go back, being in touch with friends and family back home, things like that. Like the more connections, the different points of connections you have, with your home country, I guess that's how you would maintain, the identity that you, like, the Singaporean identity in my case, and the Singaporean culture. Yeah.
How about you, Lira? Because you're a third culture kid, so you identify with, I guess, a few homes. So how do you manage this?
Yeah, I think it's about blending those and reconciling those identities. So to the person who asked this, I guess I would pose again a slight, just a suggestion of changing that, right? So I would maybe wonder what's important to this person to maintain their identity and culture, and what does that exactly mean, and what does that bring them? And then look at how we can maintain those actual base needs, because the truth is, if anybody's been away from home for 10 or 15 years, maybe even less, because we have, I think, some students here as well, even being away for a few years during your formative years can really affect your identity and culture, right? And they could be kind of gender identities too, right? Because maybe you're in a place where it's more open to be a bit more fluid. So there's different parts of our identity, cultural and otherwise, that can be changed. And if they are changed, then I guess my question would be, would that be okay to accept that they have changed? And if it's not okay to accept that they've changed, why is that, right? Is there a certain loyalty to a certain idea of your identity and culture, and who does that really affect? Are you afraid that certain people close to you will think you're a sellout, like your friends or family? If so, are you trying to maintain this for the sake of appearance and for the sake of connection to them? Then I would go, how else can you connect to them with that new identity, right? So I think this is a question that, we can speak about for ages, because this is fascinating stuff. But I feel like once you use a loaded term like an imposter of your own native culture, for me, that also reflects, it's actually a really heavy word, right? Imposter, it's a sense of inauthenticity, of lying, almost of deception. And is that actually what's happening, or has a natural, really organic change taken place that's perfectly okay? And can we move from there? And if not, then why do we feel like an imposter?
We have a question that has just come in, and in addition to, so for example, if someone tries all the strategies that we've discussed today and, really try to adapt to the new culture, but are unable to, so when do you decide that it is time to leave, your new country if you do not feel like you have arrived even after a few years? And now you didn't leave, so but if you didn't feel like you fit into, Germany, like, when do you say enough is enough?
Is the question to saying like, when do I realize it's I've had enough and I should be leaving to my home country?
The question is when to decide that it is time to leave the new country if you do not feel that you have arrived after a few years.
Okay, I mean, I feel like this is really dependent on the individual, right? When the person really determines that enough is enough. I mean, I think this one has to look at, the values, the reason for moving to the home country, into the new place in the first place. What are the reasons there? What happened? What are the reasons why the person feels that, he or she cannot assimilate? What are are there pull factors, back home? Is it, aging parents, or I think all these are like the values of the person, what are the reasons that they're moving there, and then what the actual value of the person, what they have, and then they have to kind of weigh in their own life values, and see what is important for them at that moment in their life, and then make a decision based on whether they feel like this value is more important than this value. Does that mean then, because it's more important, I have to stay or I have to leave? So I think this depends. Yeah, so I would say the first thing I would say would maybe they should look at the values that they have and how this could influence then their decision.
At this point, I just want to squeeze in one last question, because I think this is an important question that a lot of us are asking. And this is, after having lived overseas for 19 years and relocating the whole family back to Singapore to care for my aging mother, the stress level is high as I have to readapt to my birth country and helping my boys to cope with their new environment. Is there such a thing as reverse culture shock? Lira, I think you mentioned something about remote caregiving before, and I would love to hear, what you have to say to this question.
Sure. This is a great question to end off on, I guess, and because it's bringing everything back, right, in reverse. And the short answer to that is yes, absolutely. There is reverse culture shock. And it's as shocking as culture shock, if not more, because we're almost not prepared for it often, right? So I think once we have that, perhaps that new reconciled identity, we're talking about creating new identities, we are we are helplessly or undoubtedly affected by the new environments that we've been in. We view people probably differently and values, and vice versa. And I think a large part of reverse culture shock is reorienting ourselves in a situation that we are trying to connect to, maybe a Singapore or your birth country of 19 years ago, right? And those situations and social circles and ways of being might have been different. So you're reorienting that yourself in that way, but people are also orienting to you in a different way. So friends or family would have moved on in a way, right? They've created their own patterns of being, and suddenly they're kind of hooking you back into those social circles. And that requires so much adjustment as well. And you might just see things differently, right? So an example with Singapore might be, it's really hot in Singapore, right? And not many people like going for a stroll in the middle of the day, but maybe you've been really used to doing that for 19 years out, and you go back, you're like, nobody wants to go for a stroll with me at 3 p.m. This is really weird. And for some reason, part of you, it clicks, this is always the way it was. And part of you is like, how can it be? And this cognitive dissonance in so many areas is the reverse culture shock. And I think, just to respond to the last thing this person asked, caring for their aging mother and helping his or her boys cope with their new environment, that's really stressful. And I think we talked about that a little bit, the factors of those stresses of relocations and moving and the different values, right? Remote caregiving is incredibly energy requiring. It sounds like you are there in Singapore caring for your aging mother, and this starts to maybe perhaps encroach on your personal values of time, of energy, right? Personal space. I don't know if she lives with you in your family, so I can completely understand that there's reverse culture shock, and it's all very different. Yeah, not like a straightforward answer, but the most straightforward answer is yes, there is reverse culture shock.
Anna, do you agree?
Yes, I do. Yes. Yeah, definitely. So I do think that, it's like I mentioned before, like the curve of the adjustment is a U, it's an inverse U, right? So with reverse cultural shock, it's like a W, it's like the first shock with the adapting to the new country and then going back. It's like first is again like the excitement of going back, and then the shock again about, oh, these things were actually not what I expected. And then because like you already said, like the greater the one things that one doesn't expect this, the greater the shock, that it's like, wow, I didn't think that there will be difficulty adjusting back. And then coupled with this is already the shock in itself with the adjusting of the cultural related stuff. And then coupled with the other factors, helping the boys adjust, or taking care of an elderly family member, or whatever other stress factors that an individual might face, together coupled increases, of course, like stress and anxiety. And then this in turn could then, if it goes prolonged, of course, then could be maybe then could develop into, let's say, depression or anxiety disorder.
Okay, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I just want to say thank you once again to Anna and Lira for sharing your expert insights with us today. And for all of you who have taken your time out to be with us, thank you so much. If you would like to give us any feedback, please feel free to do so after the event. We'll be sending an email out. And yeah, if you want more of such events, join Singapore Global Network. Thank you all so very much, and have a great day. Bye.
Thanks for having us here. Bye, everyone.
Likewise. Bye, everyone.